The problem is that our organic industrial base is a precursor to our defense industrial base, and they're anemic. And so when Mr. Campbell mentioned about precision munitions and shipbuilding, I'm for all of that. In fact, we need that. In fact, the region needs it because they don't have big air forces and big navies. The U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force must keep the global commons open. But part of the problem is that the thing I lacked as U.S. Army Pacific Commander, and I would say that the combatant commander did as well, was sort of persistent logistics hubs forward, where you could have stores, co-production, you could have distributed and agile locations to be able to draw on those stores. And of course, this requires a really important dance between the Department of State and the Department of Defense to have those locations open and available, although we have things available today. And so I just think the window, Chairman, is narrowing, but it's also narrowing for China as well. So it's not all bad news. You know, President Xi is 71. He'll be 81 in 10 years. And I know that this window of 27 is still, you know, sort of on the table. Are they rehearsing? Are they preparing? Absolutely. But I also think that we're in a very good position to be able to counter them because we have this advantage, and that advantage is the partnerships of the allies and partners in the region. So when we can bring them together as a counterweight to the thing that they try to fragment and fracture every day is our network of allies and partners. So in summary, what I would say is our organic industrial base and defense industrial base, we need your help to get those things moving much faster. But that's not going to get us out of the problem because China is still moving with great speed. Therefore, we have to put capabilities forward, gain positional advantage forward in the region, and we have to do that with our allies and partners because those things are going to have to happen on the ground. And back to the organic industrial base, the more we bring systems forward, the more that they become closer by way of interoperability. I just read yesterday that the Taiwanese did their first live fire with HIMARS. They just bought 29 HIMARS. And you all know where we're going.
卡住进不去哎，这个伺服器怪怪的。
And the work that we actually have to do on the ground to have hard power forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And just quickly, Admiral Montgomery, you talked a little bit about cyber and resilience for our cyber security. What 2 or 3 things could we be doing to help with that?
So the most important thing for us is to get our rail, aviation, and port systems secure. And the way we do that is through legislation. And that legislation will need to address and appropriations. It'll need to address the sector risk management agencies. That's U.S. Coast Guard, Transportation Security Agency, and FAA. These are not normally what you think about in a war with China, but they're going to be the front line of the war with China. They have to be properly resourced in order to build the partnerships with the critical infrastructures. And the other problem we have is these ports, rail systems, and aviation. We're not talking about, these are county executive, county and state-run authorities. They don't have 2 wood nickels to rub together. They're going to need access to grant programs to fix the problems. As long as they do an assessment according to a government standard, find that flaw and fix it. But the government's going to have to get involved in this because the military needs these systems.
哇，凤凰座卖完了嘞，新做的那个凤凰座限量卖完了。
Thank you. Now I recognize.
太厉害了吧！
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think people in my district and across the country are a little bit on edge economically today. They're worried about access to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. They're also worried about rising costs and a potential recession. But Secretary Campbell, I feel that U.S. economic ties with Taiwan are one of the few bright spots in an otherwise economically uncertain world. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Very much so. And I would just underscore, as you yourself mentioned, what Taiwan provides to us technologically is unique globally. They are the most important ingredient in the global economy with respect to TSMC. But unlike other countries that would hoard those capabilities, as you well understand, they are building fabs now as we speak in the United States to help with that supply. They are really an outstanding partner. I think they believe fundamentally in the partnership with the United States. I completely agree that
重开游戏重开。
should not be underestimated.
Let me show this graph. It shows the remarkable increase in Taiwan's investment in America in recent years, which, as I mentioned before, spiked to $14 billion last year. But this is just the beginning. Apparently, the numbers are going to skyrocket, mostly helping my colleague Greg Stanton in Arizona. But basically, they just announced $100 billion in further investments, TSMC did, in the U.S., which will allow us to produce 30% of the world's most advanced semiconductors shortly. Let me turn to my next topic. This is a sound of an air raid siren. It goes off 3 times a day in Taiwan when Chinese warplanes fly dangerously close to the island. Imagine Russian planes approaching American airspace. Last year, Russia flew warplanes into Alaska's air defense zone 36 times. In contrast, last year, Chinese warplanes flew into Taiwan's air defense zone more than 3,000 times. this is what it looks like. These red lines around the island are basically the path of Chinese warplanes as they traversed the air defense zone surrounding Taiwan. Admiral Montgomery, by doing this, the CCP is trying to wear down Taiwan's defenders and probe Taiwan for weaknesses, right?
Exactly. This is what we would call a maximum pressure campaign. They use these military tools, cyber tools, and other financial and energy tools to put a constant pressure on Taiwan's societal resilience. And then at some later date, they can just dial that up when they see that there's no Western response.
Let me turn to my last topic. While these air crossings happen almost daily, making invasion seem possible, a more likely scenario is a CCP-led blockade of the island. And here's how it could unfold. Step one, the PLA calls snap exercises, like those after Speaker Pelosi's 2022 visit. You see all these ships surrounding the island. Step two, instead of leaving, PLA warships stay in place, and then Chinese Coast Guard and militia vessels fill the gaps, creating a de facto blockade, which of course is an act of war. Step three, the real test comes when imports like corn and soy from Illinois, Michigan, and of course South Dakota try to reach Taiwan, as you see here, but they are stopped by the CCP. In that moment, we are on the brink of war. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were famously, quote unquote, eyeball to eyeball with the Soviets, and the Soviets blinked first. But we don't want to get to that point where we need to be eyeball to eyeball with the CCP. So, General Flynn, you'd agree with me that one way Taiwan can deter a blockade is by stockpiling, for instance, corn, soy, natural gas, and so forth, right?
Yes, Ranking Member, absolutely.
What more, Secretary Campbell, do we need to do to show Xi Jinping that he should never think about trying to blockade Taiwan because it would fail?
Thanks. It's a multi-pronged strategy, frankly, Congressman. I completely agree with my colleagues about the things that we needed to step up and our capabilities. I will say,
AIG 是把
with a recognition that if such steps
是把伺服器关了吗？怎么都进不去啊？
brutal financial steps taken against it, not just by the United States, but by other countries as well. We also need more stepped up military capabilities. I think the scenario that you paint, Congressman, is the most likely. Our answer to that, frankly, is our submarine force more than anything else. It is our jewel in the crown. What you all have done recommending that more steps be taken here. I'm a huge supporter of AUKUS. I believe if the United States, Australia, and Great Britain can step up our joint capabilities, that is a major deterrent. We need to keep that area of advantage where we are still 10, 15, 20 years ahead of Beijing in operating in the undersea domain. As long as we have that, it would be very difficult to effect a successful blockade against Taiwan with those capabilities. That's the area that we need to double down on.
Sir, if I could add one cost-free idea, we need to begin practicing escorts and reflaggings with Taiwan. The other, you didn't mention it, but LNG, liquid natural gas, is the real, I think that's the first thing that's going to tighten them up during this. And we need to, ahead of the event, do reflagging and convoy escorts with the Taiwan Navy, practicing with LNGs, and even try to pull the Japanese into that as well, who are equally vulnerable to this. To me, that's a good cost-free way of signaling to China, we're not going to let this happen.
I would add
再
that
重开一次
picture you paint also is why it's so important for training on the ground in Taiwan for them to be able to see that picture and then be able to paint what they can do by way of countermeasures. This is not just a U.S. problem. This has to be a Taiwan problem, a Japanese problem, a Philippine problem. It's got to be the entire first island chain to include South Korea. And there are angles and things that we can do from areas to counter what you were just outlining there with the air and the maritime pressure from Taiwan. And that's why that training on island and the technology integration with those forces is so important. And again, I'll just remind people that at the end, the objective is to invade it, and that's the most dangerous scenario. So you can't get that force across 100 miles without us seeing it. And my point would be that we have to have the indications and warnings of what's actually happening in China with the invasion force. So we watch a lot of the air and we watch a lot of the sea, and I agree with this. The submarine force of the United States there's nothing close to it. However, to be able to extend our indications and warnings, we have to collect on the very thing that they need to actually invade, and that's the forces that are in the Eastern Theater Command. And I'm just saying, if we want to increase our indications and warnings and buy time for diplomacy and political intervention, then we need to be watching the thing that they need to actually invade, because they're not going to invade with the Air Force, and they're not going to invade with the Navy. You need a gun on the ground to be able to subjugate those people, and that's the most difficult thing that they can do. And my point is, we need to be watching that and putting the technology against watching that. So we buy more time for the United States and others to say, please, what are we doing here? We don't want another war.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General Flynn, you do make a powerful case for land power and collecting intel on the invasion force in advance as part of enhancing deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. I'm particularly interested in your testimony and the operations to place systems like Typhon and HIMARS to deter PLA planning, deployment in the Philippines, shifting the Chinese calculus. I've read about the bellicose response from Beijing related to deployment of these systems in the theater. So we've got them rattled on that. That's a piece of deterrence. I am curious to know your thoughts on cooperation from our partners in the Philippines and Japan on pre-positioning those assets at the EDCA sites in Japan, in the Philippines. And then given, I know we were just in Tokyo, the bipartisan group, their cooperation is spectacular, but with the potential relocation of the Marines from Okinawa to Guam, what is the cooperation we need on these systems in the south of Japan and in the Philippines?
Thanks, sir. Let me start in the Philippines. First of all, the benefit of having 9 EDCA sites is exponential. And I'll use another example. In Aguila Harbor in Subic Bay, we lease 3 million square feet of warehouses. And so we were trying to establish a joint theater logistics center there to be able to have commodities that we could use often. That's one location. And it's not an EDCA site, but it certainly benefits the United States, benefits the Philippine government, and benefits really a network of allies and partners to be able to have those capabilities there on the ground. On the ground, you can do co-production, you can do maintenance forward, you can fix forward, you can arm forward, and then you can distribute to the 9 EDCA sites.
我们都进不去啊。
Valuable that port, and it's a deep water port, and the warehouses are. You know, you mentioned Tokyo. I'm going to go to Japan for a minute. Last year, I was down in outside of the metropolitan Hiroshima area. There's 2 Army ports down there, and 5 different small installations that were built by the Japanese after the Second World War under the U.S. Leadership. We're only using about 40% of the storage on the ground in those facilities. Never mind Sagami Depot outside of Tokyo. Never mind the stores that we have in Kadena and Okinawa, and of course the preposition equipment that we have in Korea. I guess the point I'm making is that we have physical access right now. What we don't have, and what I mentioned in my testimony, is that we're not putting the equipment on the ground fast enough. One example, there are 7 vessels that were loaded with prepositioned equipment afloat in the Pacific. We were taking those vessels and just having the equipment float out there. My point was, let's get it on the ground and keep it distributed and give the ships back to the Navy to recap them.
Well,
So
General, thanks for your service, and I represent the Bluegrass Army Depot, part of the Army Material Command. We need to do exactly what you suggest and pre-position over in the theater. Let me ask a quick question to Deputy Secretary Campbell. Strategic ambiguity. This has been a diplomatic debate. Should we abandon strategic ambiguity? Would deterrence be served by shifting to clarity as a policy of deterrence?
So my own view would be that the policy that we've adopted over the last 40 years, which I believe has substantial elements of clarity within it, but our declaratory position that you described, I believe, has served our strategic interests. And I believe there's still elements of that can and should be sustained going forward. So I'm more focused on the steps that we're talking about here in terms of preparation. But I also believe we've been unmistakable strategically in our public declarations about what we stand for and what
Let me drill down on a detail of that. As you know, the PRC uses UN General Assembly Resolution 2758 to isolate Taiwan by misinterpreting the resolution to justify its fraudulent one China principle. Although the resolution makes no mention of Taiwan, does not authorize the PRC to represent Taiwan in the UN system, and certainly does not state that Taiwan is part of the PRC. What should be the U.S. position on China using 2758 to claim that Taiwan is part of China?
We should resist that at every possible effort, both in New York, in Geneva, and all the other UN activities that we're undertaking. But the truth is that the UN is a pretty important battleground for hearts and minds in the global south. We're frankly hurting our ability to operate in many of those capacities. I think one of the reasons to engage here is that it is essential that we get all these other countries in Latin America, Africa, and elsewhere that are buying into this approach to understand that it's contrary to their interests as well.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Moulton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the distinguished witnesses for your years of service to our country. And I tell you, I've certainly had a lot of interactions, especially with General Flynn and
太扯了吧，这么久才进去。
bipartisan and thoughtful and really focused on the national security concerns at stake here. So thank you for that. The ranking member is right that many Americans don't know where Taiwan is. But what's most dangerous is how many don't understand why Taiwan is so important. Don't understand how many chips they carry with them every day. They can only be produced on this tiny island. Now, sitting on the Armed Services Committee and the China Committee, I can tell you I am confident that if Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party do what they have promised to do and try to take over this island, try to start this war, we will win it. We will defeat them. But hundreds of thousands will die. We could lose the satellites that enable GPS, so no more Google Maps to get home. And it would be a horrific worldwide economic calamity. So the point is that we have to succeed at deterrence. Now, General Flynn, you said that deterrence is the sum of posture, capability, messaging, and will. I would posit that you can win without posture. Armies have won throughout history without the best capability, and we don't often have the right messaging, but my concern is will. I don't think it's helpful to have a president equivocate on whether we would defend Taiwan as President Trump has. Given where we are today, how do we ensure that Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party understand America and Taiwan's will to fight?
Sir, I think this is why we have to have positional advantage forward. There's no substitute for hard power being forward. And as cited earlier, the Typhoon system and others that are in the Philippines, they get the attention of President Xi.
That's a good answer.
And I think what we're trying to do is sow doubt and feed paranoia there because they did not calculate for those systems being brought in there.
Admiral Montgomery, what do you think?
I agree with your your assumption that your presumption that we need to deter them. What I would say is that I do think that it's the real deterrence is us in Taiwan.